Hello everyone. For our RonBonDujon Rambles, I want to tackle a subject that I've had a lot of thoughts on for many years, that being the kind of unsung legacy of the Pretenders. The Pretenders are often talked about as being just this horrible catastrophe of a Transformers spinoff. It's very popular for larger names in the fandom, at least a few years ago, to just take random pot shots at Pretenders, do the whole, angry video game nerd, what were they thinking? With the horrible clickbait face with the Mr. Beast fake smile. You know the type. You know what I'm talking about. Not to cast shade, but it's something that you would have seen TG Omega and Bolt Matrix, some of the older guard of Transformers YouTubers, to really hammer home the idea that the Pretenders were just this horrible little spinoff, and everybody hates them, and there was never anything good about them. And I've never really agreed with that. Keep in mind, I'm not a G1 kid. I was born in 99. My entry into the franchise would have been Armada, animated, and the 07 movie. In terms of what series I have the most love for, again, it's Armada and animated. Those are my favorite aesthetics, those are my favorite looks, a lot of my favorite interpretations of characters come from that. Everything before Armada, including to some extent its sequel series, Energon and Cybertron, I had to find out about in retrospect. I had to go back from animated to learn about Energon and Cybertron and Beast Wars and G1 and the Japanese continuities. That's all stuff that, when I was young and getting into the fandom and using the internet for the first time and discovering Wikipedia and more importantly TF Wiki, I was so obsessed with finding out about these older continuities, these different continuities. I can't tell you how much in middle school and high school I was just obsessed with TF Wiki and going through all the different pages I could. It's a big reason as to why I have such a good recollection about a good number of series, is just because I was glued to TF Wiki. And I remember going through some of the older G1 characters, and when I say older, I should say some of the later G1 characters and G1 ideas, like Action Masters and Pretenders. And even TF Wiki, they have the little snarky comments underneath pictures, and they have a little bit of an attitude sometimes in the actual articles. I remember being so, not weirded out, but so curious as to why the TF Wiki language was so dismissive of Action Masters and Pretenders. Focusing in on Pretenders, they have what I think is a really solid idea. When you buy a Pretender, it is the price of a normal Transformer figure, but you're getting a large action figure taller than most Transformers, with a smaller Transformer about the size of a mini-pot or a Scramble City Combiner limb. That's going to be your actual Transformer character. And the little Transformer can go inside the armor. The armor can now take over as the proper toy. You're getting a 2-in-1, because you're getting a big action figure and a smaller Transformer, and it's about the price of a normal-sized Transformer. And admittedly, a number of the Pretender inner robots weren't the best. There's some I can think about, say, Nautilator. His inner robot's pretty weak. I can also say the same thing about, Carnivac. Looking at the classic heroes, even though Pretender Bumblebee is great and Pretender Starscream is solid, Pretender Jazz is really kind of weedy. Has a hard time even looking over his chest. So the inner robots would often take a hit. But the outer shells tended to come with a ton of accessories, including removable helmets and different weapons, and of course there's just the fact that they were a big toy. There wasn't a lot of articulation. Usually you would just have arms up and down, maybe a swivel at the head on some of them, but then again, not always. So the Pretenders overall weren't giving you a groundbreaking action figure. They were pretty static toys. But again, the selling point to me as a kid, and the selling point even to me as an adult, is, yeah, but the toy is massive, and you're getting a Transformer with it. I think that's what's always going to resonate in my mind is, yeah, you're not buying a figure with G.I. Joe levels of articulation, which would have been about the standard by the time these guys came out. But they're about as well articulated as a lot of the monsters in the Kenner Star Wars line. And they're only a little bit less articulated than, say, He-Man figures that were not as popular, but were still around by the time that the Pretenders were coming out. And I do want to point this out too. To me, the Pretenders were the perfect marriage of the two biggest toy lines of the 80s. It was Transformers and He-Man coming together. And keep in mind, He-Man, the flagship of Mattel, for the action figure range, I should say, because Barbie always outsold He-Man. But Mattel's greatest action figure, paired up with the greatest action figure that Hasbro produced, that being Transformers. Sorry, G.I. Joe fans, but admit it, Transformers is bigger. You have Transformers, and you have something adjacent to He-Man. And they're coming together to give you this ultimate 2-in-1. And again, were I a kid of the 80s, and were I to have enjoyed He-Man and Transformers, which I assume I would, because as an adult and even as a kid, I liked He-Man and Transformers both, that is the appeal of the Pretenders. You are buying a Transformer that can also interact with your He-Man toys, and the aesthetic works. Not so much with the classic Pretenders. So like Jazz, Bumblebee, Grimlock, Starscream, they don't look as good with He-Man figures. But Bludgeon, Octopunch, Bomb Burst, Carnivac, all the Decepticons would look great with the Motu figures. Bludgeon especially. Bludgeon looks like he goes for drinks with Scareglow. Already he's there aesthetically. Octopunch, same way. He feels like a Motu character. Stranglehold literally just looks like Jitsu, for God's sake. There's so many parallels between the Pretenders and He-Man. And then, of course, there's still the fact that the inner robots are still okay. Now, I've already talked about the ones I thought were iffy, but it's funny, all the people who always hate on the inner robots of the Pretenders, they tend to gloss over the fact that Bludgeon is actually a pretty good tank by himself, easily on the same level as Brawl. They tend to gloss over the fact that Octopunch's inner robot, the Crab, is actually pretty good, has a solid G1 transformation, and that's a good 80s Crab. I'll stick by that Crab. That's the appeal. You're getting not a great, but at least a Transformer that is on par with the other Transformers of that size class. And then, of course, you get the big action figure. And the big action figure works on your Transformer shelf. It works with your Motu shelf. If you just need a big guy to fight any of your toys, it works. Because guess what? Bludgeon and Nautilus and Octopunch and Stranglehold, you could also put them against your Star Wars guys, or up against your G.I. Joe guys, up against your Toy Biz Marvel guys when we get a few years later. And they still mesh. They mesh really well in that way. So why is it, after all of this, what's what I'm looking for? All this glazing, after all of this sycophantic love I'm giving the Pretenders, why is it the Pretenders didn't catch on back in the 1980s? Keep in mind, I wasn't a kid of the 80s, so I can't tell you for sure what the general attitude or energy was around this time, but I can tell you, in retrospect, just looking at market trends, He-Man and Transformers were both very much on their way out. He-Man was amazing in the 82, 83. In 84, their sales start to go down because of G.I. Joe and Transformers getting more and more of the action figure market share. And then once we get towards around 86, He-Man's more or less on its last leg. The same thing with Transformers. Now, Transformers, its last leg would come more around 89, 90. But still not doing great. Basically, when you look at G1 Transformers, 84, big success. 85, arguably an even bigger success. 86, after the movie. That's when you start to have people move away from the cartoon. And when they moved away from the cartoon, they weren't buying the modern toys as much. So 86 is when you start to see a dip. 87 and 88, that's when things start to get real bad. That's when you have Bob Budiansky leave the comic book. Simon Furman, who is, a treasured Transformer comic writer with his own legacy, but still, the book wasn't selling as well as it once did. And the cartoon wasn't on the air anymore. toys weren't selling as well because they had already used all of the Diaclone molds and all of the other Japanese molds they were able to get. Hasbro is now making their own figures, and they're chasing every single gimmick they can. It's why eventually the Action Masters happened. It's why so many of the Transformers had sparks. It's the reason why they were just doing anything. They were throwing anything at the wall, saying, did anything stick? And nothing was. So the Action Masters were very much born of desperation. And I'm not saying this to knock the Action Masters, because again, I think they're cool. Pretenders, same way. I think the Pretenders are really, really interesting toys. But they were made because Hasbro was panicking and just trying to see what could work. There was no artistic merit behind them. Not artistic merit, but there was no artistic drive behind them. It's not like there was a comic writer or a toy designer who was like, hey, I have this idea and I want to see it fully implemented. No, it was Hasbro execs had strolled in and they were like, we are going to fire the entire department if you don't come up with a gimmick by Christmas. And so what do? Well, you start looking at what other toys are selling. You start looking at what Hasbro is still selling. And it's like, okay, if I was a Transformer toy designer, I'd go into Toys R Us. G.I. Joe is still around. Inhumanoids is still around. We're starting to see more and more gross-out toys, monster toys. Just around the corner of the 90s, you're going to start getting, like, Jurassic Park and a lot of, like, really, really big, buff, like, vascular action figures, like the G.I. Joe Extreme and a lot of the wrestling toys. So, I think that a lot of the toy designers, backed into a corner, are just go out and they say, okay, these are the toys that are selling well for Hasbro and for other companies. Can we somehow get Transformers to work into that? And that's how we ultimately wind up with Pretenders. Pretenders aren't perfect. It would have been nice if they had more articulation. It would have been nice if maybe the robot and the figure could interact more. Like, the shell is an interesting idea, but, like, maybe if the Transformer could have become, like, the midsection or the core, if there was a more obvious way to have the Transformer be a meaningful part of the shell. Then again, by not making the Transformer a meaningful part of the shell, that means that the inner robot and the shell get to be independent action figures. Right, the Pretenders had a good idea, but they weren't done exceedingly well. And even though I still enjoy the execution of a lot of the figures, like again, Bludgeon and Octopunch, it does still mean that the toys aren't exactly groundbreaking. They're not the most amazing things in the world. And that's a big reason as to why the Pretenders have never come back. There's just not a huge clamor for them. I think Hasbro, in some ways, has made a self-fulfilling prophecy, because they did try to bring back the Pretenders one time in Power of the Primes. And of course, they were just the replacement to Titan Masters, and they weren't very good, and people didn't like them, so Hasbro looks at that and they say, well, clearly people just don't want Pretenders, when the reality is, no, those were just bad toys. People didn't want bad toys, but there are people who would still like Pretenders. And I think that not Hasbro, but the Transformers Collectors Club, and their dying gasps, actually had a pretty solid idea as to how to remake Pretenders. If you were to look at the last BotCon, they did Oil Master. And Oil Master, they got a vinyl action figure company to just make a cool looking shell, and then they repainted Swerve, which was a great Thrilling 30 Legends class toy. And there was a way for Swerve to effectively park in the back of Oil Master, but because Oil Master didn't have to be a proper shell, didn't have to be fully hollow, Oil Master was able to have some limited articulation, and was decently well sculpted and well painted. Now, it's not as well sculpted or well painted as it could have been. That's because the Collectors Club was trying to make it look like the G1 prototype that never came out. But there is a good idea there. What if you just got a talented action figure company outside of Hasbro, potentially, to make a range of big hulking action figures, and then Hasbro could just focus on making the Legends class figure that would go with them. That way we get a good recreation of the inner robot and the best possible version of the shell. And this might sound very generic, it might sound very fan fiction, very fanboyish, but hear me out. With how much the Pretenders were supposed to be in the vein, in the style of Motu figures, what if we went to the single best sculptors of Motu ever, in my opinion? What if Hasbro reached out to the Four Horsemen and got them on board to do essentially a Mythic Legions style line of Pretenders? Massive action figures that would stand about current leader class height, but with proper sculpting and painting and beautiful detail and articulation. Not ultra articulated, but as articulated as a Mythic Legions figure, like their troll figures. And then the Legends class figure, just have it to where the back of these action figures will have a cavity that you could put the Legends class figure guy into. And then also, if you don't want the Legends guy, just get the Mythic Legions shell. And if you don't want the big Mythic Legions figure, just get the Legends guy. It will never happen. It will absolutely never happen. What I just said will never, ever, 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 ever happen. But it is how I would like them to do it. Because I think the Pretenders were a great idea and have a ton of potential, and the original G1 Pretender toys, on the whole, are pretty cool. Again, the high watermark is Bludgeon Octopunch, but even a lot of the other ones like Nautilator, still really nice. Some of the Autobots are even pretty cool, like Metalhawk. Hell, Bumblebee. The inner robot of Pretender Bumblebee is probably the best G1 Bumblebee toy, and the shell is decent too. There's a lot of potential in Pretenders. Potential that will never be tapped just because the only Pretender who is famous and relevant in Transformers today is Bludgeon. And Hasbro has effectively erased the Pretender part of his legacy away from him. It's very rare to get a Bludgeon that isn't just the Pretender shell that transforms into the inner robot tank. The one time they tried to make a toy of the inner robot was the 2007 Wreckage repaint. And even then they just replaced him with Revenge of the Fallen Bludgeon tank that was based on the Pretender shell. Pretender erasure is real. That is what I've learned today. And again, this isn't supposed to be a call to arms. I'm not saying that all of you need to write your congressman and demand new Pretenders. I just wish that Pretenders weren't written off as being terrible and dumb. You know, I'm sad that for such a long time, the Transformers fandom, it was really just we were listening to one generation always complain and disregard anything that came after. I've told this story before. TJ Omega is my favorite Transformers YouTuber. He's the one who inspired me to do this. It always stung whenever he would just take pot shots in Armada. Because it's like, yeah, but Armada, those were my toys, and I loved them, and I always wanted them. Him constantly taking pot shots against, like, Armada Hotshot or Armada Smokescreen. It's like, come on, dude. Are you honestly going to tell me that Armada Smokescreen isn't, like, a better toy than, like, most of G1? It's like even some Beast Wars toys I wouldn't put on the same level as Armada Smokescreen, because Armada Smokescreen is such a fun toy and is doing exactly what he wants to do. So that pain, that sense of, like, I don't want to say the old fogies, but like that sense that like the older generation just completely refuses to admit that maybe there was some cool stuff in the stuff you liked. That always sucked as a younger Transformers fan. It's the big reason why on my channel I always try to give benefit of the doubt. I always try to give proper credit and proper flowers. And at the end of the day, if I don't like something, I'll always just say, well, it isn't for me. I hope someone else enjoys it. Cyberworld is kind of bouncing off me right now. But I see so many people who are so excited for Cyberworld and are enjoying the cartoon and the toys. What's going to benefit me to start taking pot shots at Cyberworld? So what? Cyberworld's not for me. It's not made for me. It was made to get new people into the fandom. And like it or not, new people are coming into the fandom through it. That's perfect. That's beautiful. I love it. But in the same vein, I hope that we start going back and giving the proper credit to things that have been written off for so long. Things like Beast Machines. Things like Action Masters. And yeah, things like Pretenders too. The Pretenders were decent toys. a lot of them are actually great toys. And even if we never get proper modern Pretenders, I just wish that we would stop acting as though the Pretenders were the single worst thing that happened in the franchise, and that it killed G1, and all the happiness in the world died as soon as Bludgeon showed up. Come on. Come on. Pretenders didn't kill Transformers. The fact that it was a toy line with no comic, no cartoon, going into year 5 is what killed G1. It just stayed around for too long and didn't have any meaningful refresh. Pretenders was the first time they tried to change up the formula, and it didn't work. But maybe if they had tried that earlier, maybe things could have been different. Maybe if Hasbro had just attempted anything new, things could have been different. And doesn't that sound familiar to today's problems? Where we're constantly seeing Transformers shrink and less people coming into the fandom, and less fiction being allowed to spend a long time in the spotlight because Hasbro refuses to move away from G1 in any meaningful way. History repeats itself, and we apparently still haven't learned the lesson. We can't stay in 84 forever. We have to change eventually. And there's going to be good changes, bad changes, and changes that just don't pan out ultimately. The Pretenders were not a bad change. They were a change with a ton of potential, but unfortunately, it just didn't work out that time around.